The story of the Clovis culture, first Americans of the Stone Age. Scene 1, Ice and Migration. There are no borders on this map where North America and Asia meet. It's all connected. There are only white expanses stretching from horizon to horizon, broken only by a few lonely trees. But around 14,000 years ago, the ice sheet covering it began to recede. And as the glaciers melted away, so did the bridge between Siberia and North America. An entire continent disappeared beneath the waves, taking with it the indigenous people who'd inhabited it. Some drowned, others froze to death, but a lucky few survived. These are their descendants. And their story is America's story. Another group of people later arrived in North America from the south. But before we get to that, let's go back to the beginning. The sun is barely up when two groups of people arrive. In front of you, the water stretches to the horizon. Behind you, you can see the Siberian coast. Between you and Siberia, nothing. Just water. What do? Do you jump in and swim to Siberia, or do you head south along the coast? And as the glaciers in the north continued to melt, the sea level rose, eventually flooding the Bering land bridge once and for all. They followed the herds of animals that they depended on for food and shelter, and they rarely stayed in one place for more than a few months at a time. They developed new weapons and techniques for hunting large game, such as the atlatl, a simple tool that allowed them to throw their spears more accurately and with more force. They also hunted smaller animals, such as rabbits and deer, and gathered wild plants, nuts, and berries. They were not a monolithic group, but rather a collection of different cultures and ethnicities. They were able to survive the long and arduous journey across the Bering land bridge. Until next time, keep learning and stay curious. They adapted to a new and challenging environment, and they built thriving cultures despite the odds. They were the pioneers of a new world, and their legacy lives on in the rich tapestry of Native American cultures that have since flourished across the continent. They spoke different languages, had different customs and beliefs, and came from different genetic backgrounds. Despite their differences, they were all united by their common goal of survival in a new and challenging environment. They were experts at surviving in the wilderness. They knew how to build fires, find water, and protect themselves from the elements. They also had a deep knowledge of the natural world and the animals that inhabited it. This knowledge allowed them to thrive in some of the harshest environments on Earth. They made their homes in caves or under the shelter of large rocks. When they weren't traveling, they spent their time hunting, gathering food, and making tools. They lived a simple life, but it was a hard one. By 8000 BC, the continent of Beringia was gone. Those who had crossed the bridge early enough would never see their homeland again. They developed new tools and technologies, created art, and developed complex social structures. They also interacted with other cultures, both peacefully and violently. As the centuries passed, these small bands of nomadic hunters became the ancestors of the great civilizations that would one day flourish across the continent. Those who hadn't crossed yet were cut off from the rest of the world forever. They were now truly on their own. For the people who crossed the Bering land bridge 14,000 years ago, this was exactly the choice they faced. Most headed south. They followed the coast until they reached the southern tip of the Alaskan Peninsula. Then they turned east and began to follow the coastline. They traveled across that featureless white void with little more than the clothes on their backs and the spears in their hands. But eventually, after months of travel, they arrived at a new land. The Colorado River cut through the region like a scar, carving deep canyons into the rock. Towering cliffs rose up out of the desert floor, hiding ancient ruins from view. Small bands of nomadic hunter-gatherers lived in this harsh environment, eking out a living by hunting wild game and gathering wild plants. They were the ancestors of the modern Native Americans. They were the first humans to set foot here in thousands of years. It was a vast, wild, and largely empty place. The climate was warmer than they were used to, and there was an abundance of wild game. But there was also danger. New predators roamed the land, such as dire wolves, saber-toothed cats, and short-faced bears. As the centuries passed, small groups of people spread throughout the continent, each adapting to the unique challenges of their environment. Some learned to hunt the giant bison that roamed the Great Plains. Others developed new tools and techniques for hunting smaller game. Still, others moved to the coast and learned to fish. They don't know what lies ahead, but they have no choice but to find out. The world was locked in ice. But across the frigid expanse of Beringia, the first Americans came. Step by step, they moved into a new world, North America, vast, wild, and untouched. For thousands of years, these two land masses had been joined, forming a massive continent called Beringia. Hello and welcome to Paleologic. Today we're going to talk about the first Americans. Let's get into it. 14,000 years ago, the Earth was still emerging from the last ice age. Much of the planet was still covered in thick sheets of ice. That included the top of North America, which was buried beneath thousands of feet of ice. Even today, there are patches of ice left over from the last ice age, in northern Canada, Greenland, and Siberia. But back then there were many more and they were far more extensive. One of those ice caps lay over the Bering Land Bridge, which connected Siberia and North America. It's here that our story begins. The Bering Land Bridge had formed during the last ice age when the sea level was low enough for the two continents to be connected. Because of this connection, people had migrated back and forth between the two land masses for thousands of years. The oldest evidence of people in North America comes from this period. For example, the Clovis culture, named after the site where their distinctive spear points were first discovered, is associated with the oldest well-established sites of human habitation in North America. The Clovis culture thrived across much of the continent from around 13,000 to 12,800 years ago. However, recent finds such as the pre-Clovis site of Monteverde in Chile suggest that humans may have arrived in South America at least 14,500 years ago. This would put the beginnings of human migration to the Americas at roughly the same time as the first people arrived in Europe, marking an end to the long hiatus in the human fossil record after the Neanderthals went extinct. But this wasn't the only migration into the Americas. Imagine you're standing on the shores of the Bering Sea. It was a perilous journey. Along the way, they had to brave raging storms, fight off dangerous animals, and scavenge whatever food they could find. Today, this area is known as the American Southwest. But 14,000 years ago, it looked very different. When the first Americans arrived, they encountered a world unlike any they'd ever seen before. But life was not easy. Natural disasters such as floods and droughts were common. For the most part, the first Americans lived in small nomadic bands. These early Americans were highly skilled hunters. Despite the challenges they faced, these early Americans were able to build thriving cultures. The first Americans were a diverse group of people who came from many different parts of the world. In the end, the first Americans were a resilient and adaptable people. Thank you for joining me today as we explore the fascinating history of the first Americans.